There is a precise moment in history, a specific hour on a specific night, where the American dream didn't die but was quietly suffocated in its sleep. It wasn't done by a foreign army. It wasn't done by a violent revolution. It was done by 7 men, smoking cigars in a train car with the blinds pulled down. If you were standing on the platform of the Hoboken, New Jersey railway station on the night of November 22, 1910, you might have noticed the anomaly: a private rail car attached to the end of a southbound train. The car belonged to Senator Nelson Aldrich, the most powerful man in the U.S. Senate. But the men boarding it were not politicians. They were carrying hunting gear, but they weren't going hunting. They were instructed to address each other only by first names. No titles, no last names. 2 of them were so terrified of being recognized that they boarded from the shadows on the opposite side of the tracks, away from the gaslights. Why the paranoia? Why the cloak and dagger routine for a simple duck hunting trip? Because if the public had known who was on that train, and more importantly, if they knew where they were going and what they were planning, the United States would have burned before morning. These 7 men represented approximately 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. They were rivals, enemies, and competitors who had spent decades trying to destroy each other. But that night, they formed a truce. They were traveling to a private club off the coast of Georgia to draft a document that would strip the American government of its financial sovereignty and hand it over to a private cartel. They succeeded. And the money in your pocket right now? It is the direct evidence of that crime. To understand the true danger of this meeting, forget the names for a moment. Look at the Capitol. Inside that train car, it wasn't just men sitting together. It was the unnatural merger of 2 financial empires that, until that moment, had been mortal enemies. On one side, you had the Morgan Empire, a banking monopoly that controlled the railroads, the steel industry, and the credit lines of the United States government itself. On the other side, the Rockefeller Empire, the oil octopus known as Standard Oil, whose resources fueled the industry of the entire planet. Usually, these 2 clans would tear each other's throats out for a single dollar, but that night they called a ceasefire. Why? Because the prize on the table was bigger than any corporation. They were about to privatize America's printing press. Here is their personnel file, brief and without sentiment. First, Nelson Aldrich, senator, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Klan's chief lobbyist in Washington. His task was to disguise a conspiracy as a state necessity. Abraham Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, a technocrat and the inside man within the government. He was the guarantor that the U.S. Treasury would not obstruct the bankers' plans, but facilitate them. Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank, the head banker for the Rockefellers and the financial brain of the oil industry. He represented the interests of old money and industrial capital. Henry Davison, partner at J.P. Morgan Company, the right hand and attack dog of J.P. Morgan, the man who resolved the dirtiest issues through brutal negotiations or hostile takeovers. Charles Norton and Benjamin Strong, heads of the First National Bank and Bankers Trust respectively. Both were loyal lieutenants of the Morgan Army, controlling the trust funds of the New York elite. 6 men, 2 clans. But they lacked one element. They had the strength, they had the power, but they did not have the technology. They needed someone who knew the alchemy of European money. The most dangerous passenger was the 7th, Paul Warburg. Unlike the others, he wasn't just a wealthy American. Warburg was the intellectual product of the Old World. A German immigrant, a partner at the bank Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and married to the daughter of Solomon Loeb. But the critical fact of his biography is this: his own brother, Max Warburg, was the personal banker to the German Kaiser and the head of German intelligence. The Warburg family had been an integral part of the Rothschild dynasty's orbit for centuries. Paul Warburg brought to Jekyll Island what the Americans did not have: the schema. He knew how the central banks of Europe operated. He understood how to create a system that looked like a public institution but was managed like a private corporation. He was the engineer hired to build a mechanism for siphoning the wealth of an entire nation. We are approaching the moment they created the machine that controls your money today. But before we unlock the doors to that private club, I need you to do one thing. YouTube often suppresses content about financial conspiracies and banking history. To ensure the algorithms cannot bury this investigation, subscribe to the channel and like this video right now. This is your ticket down the rabbit hole. Done? Good, let's go inside. The goal of the meeting on Jekyll Island was not the destruction of competition in a primitive sense. Their motivation was far more cynical. In the banking business of the early 20th century, a problem existed. If a bank played too vaguely and issued bad loans, it went bankrupt. Depositors took their money, and the banker lost everything. This is called market responsibility. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburg wanted to abolish this responsibility. They needed a lender of last resort, a mechanism that, in times of crisis, would print money and save their banks at the cost of inflation, which would fall on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. Simply put, they wanted to build a casino where they kept the winnings and the taxpayers covered the losses. This wasn't about fighting competition. This was about ensuring their own greed with public money. But there was a problem: history. Americans didn't just dislike central banks. The fear of them was stitched into the political DNA of the nation. They remembered how Andrew Jackson destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, calling it a den of vipers. They knew that a central bank was an instrument of monarchies, a way for kings to finance wars without the consent of Parliament. For a farmer from Ohio or a merchant from Texas, a central bank meant one thing: New York's control over their wallets. So, Warburg proposed a brilliant, diabolical move. "We will not use the word bank," he said, "and we will not say that the center is in New York." They designed a structure with 12 regional branches. It was a brilliant illusion of decentralization. It looked as if power was scattered across the country, but it was a deception. The key levers, interest rates, and money issuance still remained in the hands of the same men sitting in that room. They called it the Federal Reserve, a name that sounded reliable, governmental, and boring. And it worked. But having the plan wasn't enough. They needed the law. When they returned to Washington, they realized the name Aldrich was too toxic. The public knew he was a Rockefeller stooge. The plan was dead on arrival. They needed a new strategy and a new puppet. This is where the story shifts from financial engineering to political warfare. The bankers realized that the Republican Party could not pass this bill, so the Jekyll Island cabal did the unthinkable. They switched sides. The year was 1912. The bankers needed a Democrat in the White House who would sign their bill. They found their vessel in a stiff academic governor from New Jersey named Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was the perfect candidate. He was intellectual, seemingly high-minded, and desperate for funding. But he was an underdog against the incumbent Republican president William Howard Taft. So the bankers engineered a split. Two J.P. Morgan associates heavily financed a third-party candidate, Teddy Roosevelt. The strategy was pure mathematics. Roosevelt wasn't running to win, he was running to destroy Taft. He split the Republican vote right down the middle. The result? Woodrow Wilson, with only 42% of the popular vote, slid into the presidency. The man who had campaigned against the money trust was now owned by it. His handler was a mysterious figure named Colonel Edward Mandell House. House held no official office, yet he lived in the White House. He was Wilson's alter ego. And who was House connected to? The very same banking interests from Jekyll Island. House was the conduit. He took the plan from Jekyll Island, changed the name to the Federal Reserve Act, and handed it to the Democrats as their own idea. It was a masterclass in controlled opposition. The bankers wrote the bill, The bankers funded the opposition to the bill to make it look legitimate, and the bankers funded the president who would sign the bill. History is often made in the margins when no one is watching. December 1913. The holiday season. Congress was tired. Senators were packing their bags, eager to return to their families for Christmas. The legislative session was winding down. The assumption was that no major legislation would be voted on until the new year. This was the trap. The promoters of the Federal Reserve Act waited. They stalled. They filibustered other minor bills. They waited until the trains started leaving Washington, carrying away the opposition. On December 22, 1913, the bill was suddenly brought to the floor. The most vocal critics of the central bank had already left the city. The House passed it quickly. The Senate vote was even more calculating. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the Senate passed the Federal Reserve Act by a vote of 43 to 25. Note the numbers. 27 senators were absent. Many of those absent were the bill's fiercest opponents. The document was rushed to the White House. Woodrow Wilson didn't wait. He didn't take time to review the changes. He signed it into law at 6:02 p.m. that same evening. In a letter to Colonel House, Paul Warburg later wrote, "I silently celebrated the realization of the dream of Jekyll Island. While America prepared for Christmas dinner, the 7 men from the private train had just successfully privatized the United States economy. They had granted themselves the exclusive legal monopoly to print money, loan it to the government at interest, and regulate their own competitors. So, why does this history lesson matter to you today, right now? Because the system created on Jekyll Island was designed to do exactly what it is doing today. It was designed to extract wealth from the productive class and transfer it to the financial class. Before 1913, there was no permanent income tax in the United States. The government had to live within its means. If they wanted to go to war, they had to tax you directly, and you would feel the pain immediately. But with the Federal Reserve, the government found a cheat code. They didn't need to tax you to raise money. They could just ask the Fed to print it. But here is the trick. When you print more money, the money that already exists becomes worth less. It is called inflation, but forensic economists know it by its true name, the hidden tax. Every time the Federal Reserve expands the money supply to bail out a bank or fund a war, they are stealing the value of the dollars in your savings account. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the U.S. dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power. A dollar in 1913 could buy you a day's worth of groceries. Today, it can't even buy a candy bar. That isn't an accident. That isn't bad economic weather. That is a feature of the system. That 96% loss? That is the wealth that was transferred from your pocket to the banking cartel and the government state. We live in the world built that night in November 1910. When you see headlines about quantitative easing or bailouts or interest rate hikes, you are not watching a government managing an economy. You are watching the Jekyll Island mechanism in operation. You are watching a private board of directors who are not elected by you and cannot be fired by you, deciding the price of your labor and the value of your time. The blinds on the train car are still drawn. The names have changed. It is not Morgan and Rockefeller anymore. It is BlackRock and Vanguard. It is Powell and Yellen. But the game remains exactly the same. They told us it was to prevent panics. Yet, since 1913, we had the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis, and the inflation crisis of the 2020s. The monster of Jekyll Island didn't prevent volatility. It monetized it. It ensured that when the house wins, the bankers get the bonus, and when the house loses, you get the bill. The 7 men are long dead, but the ink on the Federal Reserve Act is still wet, and the train is still moving. The only difference is now you know who is driving it. This investigation is just the first layer of the autopsy. We've dissected the birth of the Fed, but the tentacles go deeper into the IMF, the World Bank, and the digital currency systems currently being built to lock the cage door forever. If you want to understand how the same group used this money power to engineer World War I, that's a file I'm currently declassifying. Hit the like button if you want the truth, subscribe if you want to survive it. I'll see you in the next briefing.